So in the next series of lectures, we're going to be turning our attention to monetary policy. And this is going to be contrasted to fiscal policy, which we just went over. And in order to cover monetary policy, we're going to have to talk about money in banks. But before I do that, I want to do a little recap. So what we've discovered, or what we discussed when we talked about the business cycle and aggregate demand, is the economy could be in a ditch, or the economy could be underperforming. And it's going to look something like this. Here we've got price, quantity. This is the aggregate supply curve, the supply for the entire economy. And this is the aggregate demand curve. Now this is a way to show you how much is being produced right here. This is what we call QE, and the average price level, or the inflation rate, PE, right? Now the problem is sometimes the level of output is not enough to put everyone to work. In other words, think of a factory. A factory needs to produce 500 cars to put everyone to work. If the demand is only 400 cars, this means that the factory owners will have to lay off some workers. They need to get demand up to 500 units in order to put everybody to work. So let's call that QF, full employment level of output. We need this level of output right here in order to put everyone to work. And what we see is where we are, Q sub E, is not enough. So what we've got to do is we've got to get the equilibrium level of output equal to the full employment level of output. Now what we discussed, one way to do that is to shift the aggregate demand curve to the right. And we could do that with fiscal policy. So fiscal policy is comprised of tax cuts or government spending. And both of these tax cuts and government spending could, in theory, shift the aggregate demand curve to the right. Shift it to the right. And we're going to get a new equilibrium level of output that's hopefully equal to the full employment level of output. Now, what we're going to do now is we're going to be talking about monetary policy. Monetary policy, is also designed to shift the aggregate demand curve to the right. But the way it's going to do that, it's going to use the money supply to affect interest rates, and interest rates will affect borrowing, and borrowing will lead to more spending or more aggregate demand. And that also shifts the aggregate demand curve. So when we talk about fiscal policy and monetary policy, sometimes we group them under one umbrella. Here's a nice little umbrella, right? And the umbrella is demand side theory, or demand side policies. In essence, we're using the demand curve to get to full employment, as opposed to using supply side theory, which is trying to shift the supply curve to the right to get full employment. So I hope that puts things in perspective there. So, like I said before, if we're going to talk about monetary policy, we're going to have to talk about how the manipulation of the money supply impacts interest rates, and how interest rates impacts borrowing. So first thing we got to do is define what money is. Well, money is anything that fits three criteria. What are the three criteria to be considered to be money? Well, one of them, it's got to be a medium of exchange. You use it to buy goods and services and to pay off debt. So that's a medium of exchange. it also has to be a store of value. Now, what do we mean by store of value? Well, think about this. When you get paid, you do not feel the urge to spend your paycheck right away if you're paid in the form of cash or coin. The reason why is because, roughly speaking, the purchasing power of the money that you receive on Tuesday is going to be virtually the same on Wednesday. In other words, the amount of goods and services you can buy with, let's say you get paid $100 on Monday. Now, on Monday, you could buy a specific amount of goods and services for that $100, right? Well, a week later, you're still going to buy roughly the same amount of goods and services with that $100. The fact that you can buy the same amount of goods and services means it is storing the value or the purchasing power over time. Now, what if you were paid in popsicles on a hot day? If you were paid in popsicles on Monday, you better spend those popsicles right away because they're eventually going to melt. And when they melt, they are of no value to you. So in other words, popsicles are a poor store of value. Another way that we could erode the value of money is rising prices. If you get paid $100 on Monday and prices triple during that week, that means on the following Monday, you could only buy a fraction of what you could have bought the week before. In other words, the value has been depleted. So the other third thing that needs to be satisfied in order for some asset to be considered to be money is it has to be a standard of value. In other words, we could price things in these monetary units. When you go to the store and you want to buy a Subway sandwich, it costs you $5, right? You could also use that $5 to compare the value of other goods and services. If you were relying on, let's say, bartering to get goods and services, and you go to a Subway sandwich shop and they say, and you ask them how much for a Subway sandwich. They say, well, I need 5 eggs for one Subway sandwich. So that's kind of an exchange rate. 5 eggs. I'll trade you 5 eggs for one Subway sandwich. Well, if somebody else that comes in and says, I don't have eggs, how many tomatoes will you take for a Subway sandwich? Well, I'll take 20 tomatoes for one Subway sandwich. Do you see how we're having multiple exchange rates for one Subway sandwich? Things get very complicated if you cannot accurately and precisely value or price a good or service. Our life becomes very, very complicated when we can't do that. And money can be used as a standard of value, and that makes things a lot easier. So anything that fits these 3 criteria works. Now, the latest rage right now is Bitcoin. Bitcoin is what we call a cryptocurrency. And Bitcoin, I'm not going to get into cryptocurrencies right now, but some people are looking at this as a replacement for one form of money, which is cash. And really, it doesn't fit these 3 criteria. One, it doesn't really fit the medium of exchange because very few people take Bitcoin. Now, that could change over time. The other thing that it doesn't work well in is it's not a very good store value because Bitcoin fluctuates wildly in terms of value. One day it could be worth $20,000 per Bitcoin, and the next day it could be worth as low as $5,000. And this fluctuation makes it a inefficient store of value. Now, in terms of standard of value, I don't see too many things priced in Bitcoin. But so you can see how right now Bitcoin is really just an asset that people invest in, hoping that they could sell it for more money later on. And it's really not satisfying the proper definition of money. So we've covered all of these: medium of exchange, store of value. So I'm going to go on to the types of money we have in the economy. Now, most people associate money with cash or coin, but that's not the only type of money. If you go back in time in colonial America, there were no U.S. dollars. In other words, the federal government didn't print money. So there were many different things used as money or mediums of exchange. Now, after independence in the 1700s, states issued their own paper money, and gold and silver and other commodities were used as money. So there were many different forms of money in the early part of American history. And the first paper money federally issued wasn't issued until the 1860s. And then that became law with the National Banking Act in 1863, and that gave the federal government the sole authority. So in other words, states could no longer issue their money. It became the sole authority of the federal government. Now, when we talk about money, money is anything that's generally accepted as a medium of exchange. And currency or cash is not the only form of money. Checking accounts, and this is sometimes difficult for students to understand, but checking accounts and savings accounts are another type of money, and I'll go over that in a second. Now, some people say, well, okay, if checking accounts or savings accounts are a form of money, what about credit cards? Well, credit cards are used to pay for things, so that's kind of like a medium of exchange, but it's only a payment service, and there's no store of value in them. In other words, a credit card is basically, when you use a credit card, you're basically taking out a loan. And borrowed money is not considered to be money. So let me give you an example. So suppose my girlfriend and I go shopping for classic video games. And I find a copy of Music Machine for the Atari 2600, and it's selling for about $50. Now, I don't have money on me, so I get my girlfriend to pay for it. And I promise I'll pay her back sometime on a later date. Now, so we have the following transactions. The girlfriend gives a shopkeeper $50, and I give my girlfriend a promissory note to pay her back in the future, kind of like an IOU. Now, we wouldn't consider my promissory note money for a couple of reasons. One, well, money is a very liquid asset. Now, what do I mean by liquid? Liquidity simply means how quickly can you turn an asset into cash. Now, I prefer a different definition of liquidity. I prefer how easy is it to turn an asset into goods and services, because cash itself is a type of asset. So liquidity is how fast you can turn something into a good or service. Now, for example, your home, if you own your home, that's a very valuable asset, but it's very illiquid. It's not easy to convert your home into goods and services. You have to sell your home, and that takes time. And so if you're hungry and you want to eat a Subway sandwich, I know this is the second time I've mentioned Subway, using your home to buy that Subway sandwich is very difficult. It's not very easy, so it's illiquid. Cash is a very liquid form of money because it's easily converted into goods and services. Now, debt is not considered to be money because it cannot be used as a form of money to make purchases. My girlfriend can't use that IOU and buy something with it. So the loan is a mechanism in which money will be transferred from one person to another. And now in the example I gave you, when I repay the loan, I will pay my girlfriend $50, which will be in the form of money. If we consider the loan as money and the payment I give her as money, we're essentially counting that transaction twice. Now, in the next video, I'm going to be going over the different types of money classifications, M1, M2, and M3. So look forward to that.